Your doctor just told you that you are stable, your scans look good, your results are fine, and yet you still don't feel right. And that contradiction is driving you crazy, because if you're stable, why do you still hurt? Why are you still exhausted? Why hasn't anything changed? In this video, I'm going to explain why clinical stability and how you actually feel are two very different things, and why one doesn't mean the other has to improve. So your neurologist says you're stable, your MRI hasn't changed, your blood tests look fine, there's no sign of a relapse, and yet you don't feel stable at all. Maybe your fatigue is worse, maybe your vision feels slightly off, maybe there's numbness that feels more noticeable, or maybe cognitively you just don't feel like yourself anymore. So you leave the appointment confused because the word stable doesn't match your lived experience. If that's happened to you, I want you to know something important. You're not imagining it and you're not being dramatic. In a large long-term study of people with MOGAD, researchers followed patients for many years and measured their disability on a standard neurological scale known as the EDSS, along with vision tests. What they found was that many patients ended up with relatively low disability scores and fairly good vision on paper, even if they had relapses. Compared to related conditions such as neuromyelitis optica or NMO, the outcomes for MOGAD looked a lot more favourable when measured in this way. So when your neurologist says you're stable, your results and your vision look good, they're often thinking about the data in this way. For example, your long-term disability might not be getting any worse, your walking might still be okay, and your vision might still be okay too. But here's the problem. Those tests don't ask you how your body feels on a day-to-day basis. They don't measure the brain fog, the crushing fatigue, the anxiety every single time your vision blurs for a split second, or the way your life slowly shrinks because you're afraid of another attack. You might be wondering why this situation feels so unsettling. Because on paper you're stable, your scans haven't changed, your neurological exam looks okay, but your experience doesn't match that picture at all. And the reason I think this feels so confusing is because there's a space that healthcare doesn't define very well. It's the space between a clear relapse and feeling completely normal. Most clinical discussions focus on these two extremes. You're either having an acute attack or you're stable. But many people living with conditions like MOGAD or transverse myelitis spend most of their time somewhere in the middle. Symptoms fluctuate, fatigue changes week on week, vision might feel slightly worse one day and better the next, and sensations can come and go. And when those changes happen, it can be very hard to know what they mean. Is this fluctuation? Is my body under stress? Or is this the start of something a lot more serious? One of the hardest parts is that a symptom getting louder doesn't automatically mean that the condition is getting worse. That's where a lot of the anxiety comes from. Not necessarily from the symptoms themselves, but knowing how to interpret them. Because if you've experienced something like a relapse before, every change in your body can feel like a warning sign. And when doctors use the word stable, they're actually describing the absence of a relapse. But that doesn't necessarily mean that day-to-day living with the condition suddenly becomes simple. The real challenge of living with conditions such as MOGAD isn't just dealing with relapses. It's learning how to interpret the things that happen between them. Because once you've experienced that neurological episode before, your brain becomes very sensitive to any changes in your body. And every new sensation raises a question. Is this normal? Is it stress? Or is it something I need to be much more worried about? And it's this uncertainty that can be exhausting. Now for me, I remember one situation where I suddenly felt pressure returning to my lower back. And that immediately caught my attention because my first episode of MOGAD or transverse myelitis started in a very similar area. So naturally, my mind went straight to the question, is this happening again? But when I slowed down and really paid attention to what I was feeling, something was different. During my original episode, there was a very distinctive, numb, almost bruise-like feeling that started spreading across my lower back and up the side of my body. But this time that feeling wasn't there. Instead, it felt achy or more pressure based. Around that time, I'd also been under quite a lot of stress and I hadn't slept the best for the last few nights. So instead of immediately assuming the worst, I decided to monitor it, and after a few days, it had completely disappeared. Now, it's important to clarify that doesn't mean you should just ignore symptoms, but it does show that not every sensation means that a relapse is happening. Sometimes your body is just responding to stress, fatigue, changes in your routine or environment. But this is where things get much more difficult for people because healthcare is improving at identifying clear relapses, but it's much less clear about how to interpret the smaller fluctuations that happen between them, which means that often patients are left trying to figure it out by themselves, which obviously isn't helpful. On the other hand, there's also been times for me where escalating a symptom was exactly the right thing to do. For example, after my initial transverse myelitis episode, I had to start self-catheterizing due to bladder issues. And at one point, I started to feel unwell and noticed symptoms that suggested I might have an infection. And this situation was very different. I was experiencing pain and having difficulty urinating, and both of those were getting worse very quickly. And it wasn't as subtle or, I guess, as ambiguous in the same way as that previous example. This time, something clearly wasn't right. So I ended up contacting my health service, and it turned out that it likely was an infection, and that infection needed proper medical attention. So the challenge isn't simply deciding whether symptoms matter or not, it's more learning how to interpret what your body is telling you and then deciding what response makes sense in that moment. Sometimes that response might just be to monitor it and give yourself some time. And sometimes the right decision might be to escalate things and seek medical help immediately. But being able to develop that judgment does take time and experience. Over time, I've actually realized that I was almost following a simple process whenever these type of situations come up. It basically was a way of slowing things down and thinking through what's actually happening before immediately reacting to it. It's something I now think of as interpret, regulate, and respond. And in the next part of this video, I want to explain that how this way of thinking can actually make navigating the uncertainty a lot easier. Over time, I realized that when situations like this happened, I was actually following a very simple process. Now, this wasn't followed perfectly, but it was just a way of slowing things down before immediately reacting to every symptom. Because when you live with something like MOGAD or transverse myelitis, it's very easy for your mind to quickly jump to the worst case scenario. Even a small change in your body can suddenly feel like the start of another relapse. So I started thinking about these situations in 3 steps. First, interpret. This means taking a moment to understand exactly what you're noticing. What exactly has changed? Is it similar to symptoms you've experienced before in a relapse? Or is it something different? Are there any factors that could possibly explain it? For example, stress, fatigue, illness, or a lack of sleep? Now, it's important to mention that the goal here isn't just to dismiss symptoms. It's simply to look at them a bit more carefully before reacting to them. Second, regulate. Because one of the hardest things of living with these conditions is the emotional reaction that these symptoms can trigger. When you've been through something like a neurological episode before, it's completely natural for your brain to jump straight into fear mode. But that reaction can make it harder to think clearly about what's actually happening. So regulation means giving yourself a moment to slow that reaction down, taking a breath, giving yourself time, and not immediately rushing to the worst case scenario. And then finally, respond. Once you've interpreted what you're noticing and you've regulated your immediate reaction, you can then decide what response makes sense. Sometimes the right response might mean to simply monitor things for a day or two. Sometimes it might be making a note of the symptom to see if it changes. And sometimes the right decision might be to contact your medical team and get advice. Now remember, the goal isn't to ignore symptoms. The goal is to respond to them more thoughtfully instead of reacting purely out of fear. And for me, thinking in those 3 steps, interpret, regulate, and respond, helped make that grey zone between clinical events a lot more manageable. It doesn't remove the uncertainty completely, but it does give me a way to navigate it much more calmly and confidently. Because stability doesn't necessarily mean that symptoms just disappear overnight. Often it means learning to live with the ups and the downs that come with these conditions, and learning to interpret what your body is actually telling you along the way. So if your doctor has told you that you're stable, but your body still feels like it's a bit unpredictable, I want you to know that you're not imagining things. Clinical stability and lived experience are often two very different things. Stability in conditions like MOGAD or transverse myelitis often mean that the disease itself isn't actively causing new damage, but it doesn't necessarily mean that symptoms disappear overnight. Recovery can take a long time, symptoms can and will fluctuate, and learning how to interpret those changes is often one of the hardest parts of living with these conditions. For me, learning how to slow that reaction down and move through the three steps, interpret, regulate, and respond, made that uncertainty much more easier to live with. And that's not because the symptoms disappeared, but because I stopped feeling like every little change felt like something catastrophic could be happening. And this is something I'll be talking about a lot more on this channel. That stability in neurological conditions often isn't about feeling perfect or being 100% back to normal again. It's about learning how to navigate the changes without immediately assuming the worst. I'm curious if that's something that you've experienced too. Have you ever been told that you're stable medically but your body just doesn't feel that way? Let me know in the comments section below, because I think this gap between the clinical stability and the lived experience is something that quite a lot of people experience and they don't tend to talk about it too much. If you want more practical guidance on living with MOGAD and making sense of symptoms like this, you can join my email list and the link for that is in the video description below. And if you want to hear more about the long-term journey of living with MOGAD, I also made a video reflecting on my 6 years of living with the condition, which you can check out here.